Gather close, for history remembers what the world has forgotten. In the bitter Scottish winter of 1440, when snow lay thick upon the Highland peaks and political intrigue festered in every castle hall, a dinner invitation would be issued that would echo through history as one of the most treacherous betrayals ever conceived. The tale I'm about to tell you inspired what modern audiences know as the Red Wedding from Game of Thrones. But the reality was far more brutal, far more calculated, and far more devastating to the future of Scotland itself. This is the story of the Black Dinner, a feast that would claim the lives of two young earls and plunge Scotland into decades of bloody civil war. To understand the horror of what transpired, we must first understand the Scotland of 1440. King James II was but 10 years old, a boy king whose minority had created a dangerous power vacuum that ambitious nobles rushed to fill. The real power lay not with this child, but with the regents who claimed to rule in his name. Chief among these was Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor of Scotland, a man whose political cunning was matched only by his ruthless ambition. Crichton controlled Edinburgh Castle and, more importantly, controlled access to the young king, but his grip on power was far from secure.
Wait, so Scotland basically had no real king at this point?
Exactly. A 10-year-old cannot rule a kingdom torn by feuding nobles and border wars. And the most powerful threat to Crichton's authority came from the House of Douglas, whose influence stretched across the Scottish borders like a spider's web of loyalty and fear. The Douglases were no ordinary noble family. For generations, they had been the sword and shield of Scottish independence, their red heart blazon a symbol that struck fear into English invaders. But by 1440, their power had grown so vast that many whispered they had become kings in all but name. The current Earl of Douglas was William Douglas, 6th Earl, barely 16 years old but already inheriting a legacy that made him one of the most powerful men in Scotland. His younger brother David stood beside him, equally young, equally proud, equally unaware of the trap being laid around them. These were not mere children playing at nobility. The Douglas lands sprawled across southern Scotland, their retainers numbered in the thousands, and their castles controlled key routes between Scotland and England. When the Earl of Douglas called his men to arms, the ground trembled with the march of boots and hooves.
How much power are we talking about here? More than the king?
In practical terms, absolutely. The Douglases commanded loyalty from border reivers, Highland clansmen, and lowland farmers alike. They had their own armies, their own justice, their own foreign policy. To many Scots, William Douglas was more their true lord than the boy king locked away in Edinburgh. This terrified men like Crichton. Every day the Douglas brothers grew older, more experienced, more entrenched in their power. Every day, Crichton's own position became more precarious. But Crichton was not alone in his fear of Douglas power. Another player had entered the game, Sir Alexander Livingston, who controlled Stirling Castle and harbored his own ambitions for controlling the young king. Normally, Crichton and Livingston were bitter rivals, each scheming to undermine the other. But the Douglas threat was so overwhelming that these enemies found common ground in a most unholy alliance. The plan they hatched was as simple as it was diabolical. The Douglas brothers must die, but it could not appear as murder. Scotland's nobles would never stand for the open assassination of such powerful figures. No, this required a subtler touch.
They were planning to murder teenagers.
I'm afraid so. In the brutal politics of medieval Scotland, age offered no protection from ambition. These men had convinced themselves that the greater good of Scotland required the elimination of the Douglas line, regardless of the brothers' youth or innocence. The invitation, when it came, was perfectly crafted. King James II, or rather his regents, cordially invited the Earl of Douglas and his brother to dine at Edinburgh Castle. It was presented as a reconciliation, a chance to heal the growing rift between the Crown and Scotland's most powerful family. In October 1440, the Douglas brothers began their journey north toward Edinburgh, completely unaware they were riding toward their doom. Their retinue was impressive but not overwhelming, perhaps 24 men, enough to show their status but not so many as to appear threatening. As they approached Edinburgh, the brothers would have seen the ancient fortress rising from its volcanic rock, a symbol of royal power that had stood for centuries. They had visited before, had dined in those halls, had played as children in those courtyards when relations between Douglas and Crown were warmer.
Did they suspect anything? Any warning signs?
If they did, they chose to ignore them. Perhaps their youth made them overconfident, or perhaps generations of Douglas power had made the thought of royal treachery seem impossible. The Douglas motto was, "Forward," and forward they rode, straight into the spider's web. The brothers were received with all due ceremony. Banners flew, trumpets sounded, and Crichton himself greeted them with warm smiles and warmer words. Everything appeared normal, even friendly. The afternoon passed pleasantly enough. The Douglas brothers were given fine quarters, their horses were stabled and fed, and their men were accommodated in the castle's lower halls. It seemed, for all the world, like a perfectly normal diplomatic visit. Meanwhile, in the Great Hall, preparations were underway for what would become the most infamous dinner in Scottish history. The tables were set with the finest silver, the best wines were brought up from the cellars, and the kitchen staff prepared a feast worthy of such distinguished guests. But in the shadows, other preparations were being made. Crichton's soldiers were being positioned at key points throughout the castle. Escape routes were quietly blocked. The trap was being set with mechanical precision. And somewhere a cook was preparing a very special dish, the symbolic centerpiece that would signal the beginning of the end. As evening fell on November 24th, 1440, the great hall of Edinburgh Castle blazed with torchlight and rang with laughter. The Douglas brothers entered to fanfare and applause, taking their places of honor beside the young King James II, who smiled and chatted with his guests, unaware of the horror about to unfold. The irony was cruel. Here sat a child king, manipulated by ruthless men who claimed to act in his name, about to witness an act that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first courses were served with great ceremony: venison, beef, fowl, fish, all the delicacies befitting such an occasion. Wine flowed freely, toasts were made to friendship and unity, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that Scotland's troubles might indeed be resolved through diplomacy rather than bloodshed.
This is like the calm before the storm, isn't it?
Precisely. The most sinister kind of calm. The Douglas brothers were relaxed, perhaps even enjoying themselves. They had no reason to suspect that every smile around them masked murderous intent. Crichton played his part perfectly, the gracious host concerned only with his guests' comfort. But as the evening wore on, he began to signal his conspirators with subtle gestures. It was during the final course that the true purpose of the evening was revealed. A great silver platter was brought before the Douglas brothers with unusual ceremony. When the cover was lifted, gasps echoed through the hall. There, on the finest silver in Edinburgh Castle, lay the severed head of a black bull, the ancient Scottish symbol of death and judgment. The hall fell deadly silent. Every person present understood the meaning. This was not a meal, it was a trial, and the verdict had already been decided.
Oh, God, that's horrible.
It gets worse, I'm afraid. Young William Douglas, to his credit, immediately grasped the situation. He rose from his chair, his brother beside him, and demanded to know the meaning of this insult. Crichton's reply was cold and final. The Douglas brothers were accused of treason against the crown, of raising armies without royal permission, of treating with England behind Scotland's back. The charges were largely fabricated, but in that hall, surrounded by armed enemies, the truth mattered little. What followed was a parody of legal proceedings. The Douglas brothers, 16 and younger, found themselves on trial for their lives with no chance to call witnesses, no opportunity to present a defense, and no hope of a fair hearing. The young king, barely understanding what was transpiring, was forced to sit in judgment on guests who had come to his table in good faith. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire affair, using a child as a puppet in such a monstrous deception. William Douglas spoke with a dignity remarkable for his age. He denied the charges, pointed out that his family had served Scotland faithfully for generations, and reminded all present that he had come to Edinburgh under a guarantee of safe conduct.
Surely someone tried to stop this.
A few voices were raised in protest, but they were quickly silenced. Crichton and his allies had planned too well. Anyone who might have supported the Douglases was either absent from the castle or cowed into silence by the naked display of force. The brothers found themselves completely surrounded, their own small retinue vastly outnumbered and strategically positioned away from the great hall. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one: death for treason. The sentence was to be carried out immediately, before any Douglas allies could mount a rescue or word could spread beyond the castle walls. What happened next violated every code of medieval hospitality and honor. The Douglas brothers were dragged from the hall where they had dined as honored guests and hauled to the castle courtyard where a block and axe waited in the torchlight. There was no time for final prayers, no opportunity to send last words to their family. This was butchery disguised as justice, murder cloaked in legal proceedings. William Douglas, Earl of Douglas, died first. Even facing death, the 16-year-old showed remarkable courage, refusing to beg for mercy from men he knew had none to give.
Wait, they actually went through with it. They murdered children.
I'm afraid they did. David Douglas followed his brother moments later, meeting his end with equal bravery. 2 lives snuffed out in their prime, not for any real crime, but because their very existence threatened the ambitions of ruthless men. The deed was done. The most powerful noble family in Scotland had been decapitated in a single night of treachery. News of the Black Dinner spread across Scotland like wildfire, and the reaction was everything Crichton had feared and worse. The Douglas clan's allies were not cowed by this display of royal power, they were enraged by it. Within days, Douglas banners were being raised across the borders. The dead brother's great-uncle, James Douglas, Earl of Avondale, declared himself the rightful heir and began gathering an army for vengeance. The young King James II, traumatized by what he had been forced to witness, reportedly wept for days after the executions. Even at 10 years old, he understood that something fundamental had been broken that night, not just the lives of 2 young men, but the very concept of royal honor and hospitality.
So it backfired completely?
Spectacularly. Instead of eliminating the Douglas threat, Crichton had transformed it into something far more dangerous, a cause that could unite Scotland's nobles against what they saw as tyrannical rule. The Chancellor found himself facing not just Douglas revenge, but condemnation from nobles across Scotland who realized that if this could happen to the mighty Douglases, it could happen to anyone. The Black Dinner set in motion a chain of events that would plague Scotland for decades. The Douglas Wars, as they came to be known, would continue intermittently for the next 15 years, draining Scotland's resources and weakening the kingdom just when unity was most needed. England, Scotland's eternal enemy, was quick to exploit this internal strife. English raids increased along the borders, taking advantage of the fact that the very families who had traditionally defended Scotland were now locked in civil war with the Crown. The ripple effects extended far beyond military conflict. Trade suffered, agriculture was disrupted by constant warfare, and Scotland's international reputation was damaged by what was seen as a barbaric violation of the laws of hospitality. Foreign courts were appalled by the treacherous murder of guests under royal protection. This was not how civilized kingdoms were supposed to behave, even in an age when political violence was commonplace. But perhaps the most tragic consequence was the corruption of young James II himself. A king who should have learned justice and honor instead learned that might makes right, and that oaths could be broken when convenient. The boy who wept at the Douglas executions would grow into a man known for his ruthlessness, his distrust of his own nobles, and his willingness to use extreme violence to maintain power. The trauma of that night in Edinburgh Castle shaped not just a king, but the very nature of Scottish kingship for generations to come.
So the conspiracy to save the kingdom actually destroyed it?
In many ways, yes. Crichton and his allies believed they were protecting Scotland from Douglas dominance, but they succeeded only in plunging the realm into chaos and teaching future generations that political problems could be solved through betrayal and murder. Yet the House of Douglas proved remarkably resilient. Within a few years, the family had not only recovered, but had arguably become more powerful than ever. their cause strengthened by the martyrdom of the murdered brothers. James Douglas, who assumed the earldom after the brothers' deaths, proved to be everything Crichton had feared the younger Douglases might become, a capable military leader with both the will and the means to challenge royal authority. The irony was bitter and complete. The Black Dinner had been intended to prevent the Douglases from becoming too powerful, but it had instead created exactly the scenario Crichton had sought to avoid. Crichton himself would eventually fall from grace, his reputation forever tainted by his role in the treacherous murders. His political career effectively ended by the consequences of his own actions. The Black Dinner became a byword for treachery in Scottish culture, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the violation of sacred hospitality. The phrase "Black Dinner" entered the Scottish vocabulary as a synonym for betrayal, particularly betrayal of guests or those who had come under promise of safe conduct. But the story's influence extended far beyond Scotland's borders. The tale spread throughout medieval Europe as an example of the depths to which political ambition could sink, inspiring both historical accounts and fictional adaptations for centuries to come.
Is this really where George R.R. Martin got the idea for the Red Wedding?
Martin has acknowledged that the Black Dinner was indeed one of his primary inspirations. The parallels are unmistakable. The violation of hospitality, the betrayal of guests, the political motivations, even the symbolic elements like the bull's head that became the Red Wedding's severed wolf's head. But Martin's fictional version, brutal as it was, actually sanitized some aspects of the real event. His victims were adults engaged in active rebellion. The real Douglas brothers were teenagers whose main crime was being born into a powerful family. What lessons can we draw from this 500-year-old tragedy? Perhaps most obviously, that political solutions achieved through treachery and murder rarely solve the problems they're intended to address. Crichton's fundamental error was believing that he could eliminate a political problem by eliminating the people who embodied it. But political power is never just about individuals. It's about systems, relationships, and loyalties that survive even when specific leaders fall. The Black Dinner also demonstrates the importance of legitimacy in governance. Crichton may have controlled the machinery of government, but his actions at Edinburgh Castle stripped away any moral authority he might have claimed.
It sounds like he created the very thing he was trying to prevent.
Exactly. By using treachery and murder as political tools, Crichton legitimized their use by others. The Douglas Wars that followed were in many ways simply the logical consequence of the precedent he had set. But perhaps we should not lose sight of the most important lesson of all, the human cost of political ambition. William and David Douglas were not statistics in a history book. They were real young men with hopes, dreams, and futures that were brutally cut short. Their deaths rippled outward to affect not just the political landscape, but families, friends, and communities across Scotland. Every political decision, no matter how grand its supposed justification, ultimately comes down to its impact on real human lives. The tragedy of the Black Dinner was not just that it failed to achieve its political objectives, but that it reduced human beings to mere obstacles to be eliminated. In our modern world, where political polarization sometimes seems to reduce our opponents to caricatures rather than fellow human beings, perhaps this medieval tale has more relevance than we might initially suppose. The Black Dinner stands as one of history's most perfect examples of how the means can corrupt even the most well-intentioned ends. Edinburgh Castle still stands today, its great hall now a tourist attraction rather than a center of political power. But the stones that witnessed that November night carry their burden of memory still. Visitors can still walk the halls where the Douglas brothers dined in trust and died in betrayal, a reminder that the past is never truly past, that the consequences of our actions echo far longer than we might expect. The story continues to fascinate because it touches on fundamental questions about power, loyalty, and morality that every generation must grapple with anew. How far is too far in the pursuit of political goals? When does pragmatism become mere cynicism? How do we balance competing loyalties and responsibilities? These questions had no easy answers in 1440, and they have no easy answers today. The Black Dinner reminds us that every generation faces the same fundamental choice between honor and expedience, between doing what is right and doing what seems advantageous. The Douglas brothers chose honor even in the face of death. Their killers chose expedience and lived to see their schemes crumble into chaos and bloodshed. History has rendered its verdict on which choice proved wiser. In the end, perhaps that is the Black Dinner's most important lesson, that some victories are not worth winning, that some solutions create more problems than they solve, and that honor, once lost, is not easily regained. The bull's head on that silver platter was meant to symbolize the death of the Douglas brothers, but it became instead a symbol of the death of something far more precious: the trust that makes civilized society possible. Our story ends here, but the echoes of the past continue. Your voice guides where we travel next. Leave a comment with the events or figures you'd like to explore, and subscribe to join this growing fellowship of medieval storytellers.